What are we talking about? What are we talking about? DNA. And I'm not talking about the battle rapper. I'm not talking about the battle rapper. I'm talking about human DNA. Like, for some of us, it's been a long time since we've studied it. Some of us just like briefly looked into it in high school. What are we talking about? DNA should completely freak you out if you studied it. If you've been following like what we understand about cells and about humans, DNA should freak you out. We're going to go all the way back. We're going to go all the way back to Paley's teleological design argument. William Paley, at the turn of the 18th century, no, at the turn of the 19th century, late 1700s, turn of the 19th century, William Paley made the watchmaker argument. He said, if you're walking through a forest and you see a watch, you wouldn't assume that that watch got there by natural causes. If you were walking through the forest and you saw a watch sitting on the ground, you would not assume that that watch got there by natural causes. It's too intricate a design. It's obviously designed. And so he said, when you look at the human eyeball, when you look at the human face, when you look at the intricacies of the nose and the ears, you should come to the same conclusion that this was not put here by accident. This was not evolved by random mutations and natural selection. Isaac Newton wrote a book called The Optics. And he wrote something, and I don't know if he meant it to be poetic. I don't know if he meant it to rhyme. But in Isaac Newton's book, The Optics, he said, how came the human eye to be contrived with so much art? And to what ends are its several parts? How came the human eye to be contrived with so much art? And to what ends were its several parts? What Isaac Newton was trying to break down was, it looks like the human eye was created with a goal in mind. It looks like the human eye was created with purpose and intention. Even evolutionary biologists use purposeful language when you think about it, right? Like they say the purpose of the rhinoceros horn is, the purpose of the dolphin fin is, instead of saying that these things have no purpose, but they're just evolutionarily advantageous, which is what they would say, right? If they took their own beliefs to heart. I don't want to get too far off track. We're talking about DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid. The only reason I know that term is I just finished reading a book by Stephen C. Meyer, Dr. Stephen C. Meyer, called Signature in the Cell. This is an incredible book, and it starts with William Paley. It starts with the design argument in the early 1800s. I keep saying the early 1800s. It's the early 1900s. Listen. From 1700 to 1800 is the 18th century. That throws me off track. And then from 1800 to 1900 is the 19th century. So that's where I get thrown off. Anyway, at the turn of the 18th century, which is the late 1700s, William Paley made an argument, and he said, if you were to find a watch lying on the ground in the middle of the forest, you wouldn't assume that that watch got there by natural selection and genetic mutation. You would assume it was designed, because it's way too intricate for nature to have created that. And he said the human being is is similar. You can look at the structure of the human eye, the human nose, the intricacies of the mouth, the lungs, the ears, and come to the conclusion that this was not on accident, that we were put here on purpose by an intelligent agent, right? So after William Paley came Pierre Laplace. So he was the beginning. A lot of people think it's Darwin. It wasn't Darwin who started this spiral into naturalistic postmodern thinking. It was Pierre Laplace with his nebular hypothesis. He applied it to the Earth. He said the Earth got here not by creation, right? A mind didn't put this here. It was a bunch of space dust and gravity acting on space dust and rocks being brought together to create the Earth. And a lot of people started to roll with that. Are like, okay, well, if we don't need God to create the Earth, then you had, Charles Lyell and the sedimentary hypothesis, where he said, look, we don't need mountains to be formed by God either. I can prove how mountains come together, because of the shifts in the Earth's crust. And I can tell, how the Grand Canyon, how water can do that naturally. We don't need a creator being for that. So after Pierre Laplace and Charles Lyell, you have, then Charles Darwin, who comes in and says, okay, well, for the origin of species, we no longer need God either, because I can tell, by natural selection and random variance, genetic mutation, how we can get different species also. So you have the Earth being made by natural causes. That was posited by Pierre Laplace. You have the mountains and the sediment coming together by natural causes. That was Charles Lyell. And then you have Charles Darwin saying, look, even species can come together without the help of a creator being. And so you start to get this naturalistic thinking in the sciences. There was a book by Jacques Monod. I read that book too. It's called Chance and Necessity. Science was hijacked in the middle of the 19th century by this concept that everything created has to be either by chance or by necessity. It can't be created. It can't be intentional. It has to have either happened by chance or by necessity. An example of something that arises by necessity is salt, right? Electrostatic pressure brings together sodium and chloride. So sodium chloride is salt, right? Those two elements come together naturally. That's an example of necessity. And then chance, chance variations when things mutate. So listen, here's what I want to say. Let's keep going through this history. So you have Darwin. You have this concept in the sciences that everything happens because of chance and necessity. But that breaks down 100 years after Darwin, right? Darwin was in the 1850s. 100 years after Darwin, you have Francis Crick, who elucidates the structure of the DNA molecule. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about DNA. He elucidates the double helix structure of the DNA molecule, and what he discovers is sequence specificity. Listen closely. The DNA molecule contains a chemical alphabet. I'm going to say that again. The DNA molecule contains a chemical alphabet. You can look this up. It's like adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. That's a 4-letter chemical alphabet. I'm not going to get too complex because I just read the book, right? RNA polymerase makes a copy of DNA and then converts that 4-letter chemical alphabet into a 20-character amino alphabet, amino acids, right? And so the question becomes, that's information. We're in the information age, and every single one of your cells is books worth of information. And by information, I mean characters put together to perform a communication function. Just like a sentence, right? If you think about a word, right? Like a book contains more information than a paragraph. A paragraph contains more information than a sentence. A sentence contains more information than a word. A word contains more information than a letter, right? You understand? And the reason is because the longer the paragraph, the more communication there is. That's what information is. It's characters put together to perform a communication function. And that's the exact type of information that's in our DNA. It is really, really a trip. So here's the question you have to ask yourself. Where do we find information naturally occurring? It's a question for any atheist that's in this chat, any atheist that knows me, because this is bugging me out, right? The great pragmatist, Charles Sanders Peirce, the father of the philosophy of pragmatism, the father of the scientific concepts of multiple competing hypotheses, inference to the best explanation. What makes an explanation for a phenomena better than the other explanation? What makes an explanation best? Because how do we explain the presence of information in our cells without a mind producing it? When does nature ever produce information? In this book that I read, he talks about Mount Rushmore. Like, what are the chances that Mount Rushmore was not designed? Right? That the sediments and erosion and rain just naturally carved out the face of 4 presidents. What are the chances of that happening? Of nature performing a communication function? They're mathematically 0, right? Nature just doesn't do that. It doesn't perform a communication function to a conscious brain. So when we look in our cells and find that in the proteins of our cells, right? Here's what sequence specificity is. In our proteins, there's a 4-letter chemical alphabet that's copied by RNA and turned into a 20-character amino alphabet. And the amino alphabet has to be put in precise place, almost like a written sentence, right? If I were to spell out the sentence, I love you, it only performs a communication function if the letters are in the right order. So the exact same thing is happening inside of every single protein in every single cell of your body, right? There's a 4-letter chemical alphabet being copied and turned into a 20-character amino alphabet and then put back in a structured way, 150 characters long for a simple protein, right? And the question among scientists, the DNA enigma, is how did that information get there? How did that information get there? It's out of the realm of the sciences. Science studies nature, right? I get so many atheists who come up to me and who say, give me scientific proof of God. And I have to say, listen, science studies nature. What are you talking about? The existence of God is not a scientific hypothesis. It's a philosophical question. Philosophy gives you ideas, the sciences gives you evidence, and sometimes math can give you a proof. Here's the DNA enigma. And I'm going to give you the name of the book again so you can look up the book if you want. And I'm giving you a condensed version of it. That might be the reason what I'm saying sounds a little dense. The book is called Signature in the Cell. It was written, I think, 6 or 7 years ago by Stephen C. Meyer. Here's the question. DNA contains information. We know that now. The only reason Charles Darwin thought that evolution was possible is because he thought the cell was way more simple than we're figuring out it is. The only reason Charles Darwin thought evolution was possible is because he thought the cell was a homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. Boy, was he wrong. Boy, was Charles Darwin wrong. He thought that the blood cell was like a bit of jello, that it's just the same through and through, that there's nothing really complex going on in there. He had no idea that inside there was chemical machines, right? that there was proteins that were catalyzing chemical reactions, that there was a whole alphabetic structure, like that there was a book on how to build you in every single protein. He had no idea. If Darwin would have known that, he would have thrown his book in the trash. What are we talking about? Here's the question. I know I keep skirting around it. I think I've said it a couple times. The question is, how did information get into your cells? We know that it is not in question that we're in the information age with respect to DNA. There is information in your cells. So the question is, what besides a mind produces information? Is information ever accidentally produced? Give me an example. And shut me up. If you're an atheist, you can shut me up. If you can give me an example of a communication function being performed without a mind producing it. The reason the book is called Signature in the Cell is because in the cell, in that alphabet, in that written language that's inside every one of your proteins, is the signature of God, the unembodied mind from which all matter and energy is derivative. That's what God is. What exactly are we talking about? How could you not think God exists if you've studied if you've studied yourself? The temple at Delphi in Greece says, know thyself and thou shalt know the universe and God.